Spotlight, a program which looks at issues of interest to you. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Grantley Walron.
As I was heading to the studio this afternoon, I was pleasantly assailed by the pleasant voice of Bob Marley singing Redemption song. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Only we can free ourselves, free our mind. At this time, Guyanese of African ancestry celebrate the 170th anniversary of the formal removal of the right which was held by British subjects to hold and to trade in slaves. 170 years later, Guyanese of African ancestry have now, as it were, earned the right to have ideas and to represent them, to choose their leaders, to assemble as they see fit, to choose their mode of employment, to, as it were, make decisions and act on the direction of their lives, whether this is defined in economic, social, or political terms. In a certain sense, 170 years later in this country, Guyanese of African ancestry also, and this is like their Amerindian brothers who predated them here, and the Guyanese of Indian, Portuguese, Chinese, and mixed groups who postdated them here, they all, as it were, are suffering from the debilitating, dehumanizing, and in a certain sense, the very destructive forces that have been unleashed on this country on account of, well, whether it's on account of or whether that is part of a deteriorating economy, deteriorating socio-political environment, the escalating violent crime, and a lack of security, they, as it were, are also crying out to some measure of emancipation from all of these ills. We, however, shall be focusing on what we call here Emancipation 2, but the spotlight will be on the African dimension. To assist us in this exploration at this time are Dr. David Hinds, who is no stranger to the Guyanese public. David, of course, being a socio-political and economic commentator of wide repute, himself substantively assistant professor at University of Arizona, and Mr. David Granger, who is best now known as publisher of the Guyana Review, but who also in another life has gained a lot of plaudits as Chief of Staff of our Defense Force, and many other things, apart from currently, I think, serving as an advisor on the Defense Board. Gentlemen, our forefathers, their vision, was it illusory and misplaced? This notion of the freedom for which they fought and won, and which we now celebrate. Who'd like to start?
I'll give the story and the honor. Start it.
Well, I'm not a historian. I used to be a student of history. It was no mistake. I think they were quite prepared. Many of the people in the plantations of the New World, particularly the Caribbean, fought, suffered for emancipation. In fact, the largest slave revolt in this country occurred in 1823, exactly 10 years before the Emancipation Act was drafted. And of course it was introduced into Parliament the following year, 1834. Although, to correct the moderator, most historians regard 1838 as the date of emancipation, not 1834. So we really should be celebrating 166 years, because the period between 1834 and 1838 was a bogus freedom. It was called apprenticeship, but most Caribbean historians don't regard 1834 as the date of emancipation, but that's a technicality. But generally, I think our forefathers were well prepared for freedom. It's something they wanted. And within a few months after emancipation, they started to set up the villages. And the African village movement was a remarkable feat of transformation of the landscape, the coastal landscape. And in those villages, I think those villages served as a crucible for a new society, a society built on Christianity. And the saying goes, if you go into Victoria Village, you throw a stone in the air, it will land on a church. There were so many churches there. It was a society built on education, on schools, particularly with the assistance of the Congregationalists. It was a society built on labor, because every plot of land had a farm attached to it, either a small kitchen garden in front or something in the back dam. And it was a society built on the family, on the household. They didn't want to live in any barracks, they didn't want to live in lodges, they wanted to consolidate the nuclear family, whether they were married in church or not. They understood what a family meant. And surprisingly to the Europeans, after emancipation, Africans who had been taken as far away as Wakinam and Leguan left where they were to come back to reunite with their families. And also in the plantations, they started to remove their children and the women from the sugar plantations to build their homes and to work on their own farms. So this is something that they wanted, it is something they anticipated, and it is something for which they had, I would say, a correct formula. And for many years, it brought about success. And so I would feel that, that the first emancipation was a correct move. And there was no compromising on their liberty, there was no compromising on their dignity, and there was no compromising on their success. A lot of things happened afterwards, but we'll come to that. But certainly, it happened at the right time, and it helped to create what we call the modern nation state of Guyana. Without emancipation, this country would have just been a whole long string of estates. It was the Africans who created free villages. It was the Africans who created the means by which the economy could be diversified, the means by which religion could flourish, education could flourish. All of these things came from emancipation. It was really the birth of the Guyanese nation, 1st of August, 1838.
I think David hits the nail on the head there. The emancipation was a process, I would say, that began from the time our foreparents boarded those slave ships, because they began to resist and began to, in a sense, lay down the gauntlet, that we want to be free and we will be free. So the process of emancipation began since then, and so by the time we got to 1838, our foreparents were ready. They had a vision of what they wanted. And emancipation is important, as David says, for the birth of the Guyanese nation, because the fact that Africans were emancipated meant that they could not be slavery anymore. It meant that East Indians and Chinese and Portuguese coming after would not come into a slave situation. So that the emancipation has national significance, and African Guyanese are integrally a part of the nation, not only in terms of the birth of the nation, but in terms of the early, putting the early building blocks for the nation in place.
You know, what was interesting is that I think David in his And David, I'd have to say David 1, David 2. Presumably we would have set on the Guyanese nation David against the Goliath of desperation. And now, David alluded to the fact that the basis for the creation of wealth, the diversification of the economy as opposed to just a string of estates, as it were. Even as they set up their own villages and they set up their own homesteads, etc. But the thing is that they seem to have left us so much, but we have done so little with it. Any comment?
Well, it wasn't plain sailing for the freed Africans. There was a clash. You had a plantocracy controlling the estates, which produced sugar. And that demanded not only land, but also capital and labor, which the Africans possessed. By attempting to set up free villages, they created an artificial shortage of labor on the plantation. So this was regarded not as a voluntary movement, but as a challenge to the estates. So from the outset, there was a confrontation between the peasantry, this free peasantry, who control their labor, and the plantocracy, who wanted to control their labor. So there was a strong element of provocation. In fact, you may notice that the first village was established not in 1838, when the Africans became free, but in 1839. So there are some people who like to think that, as soon as Africans became free, they walked off their estates. There was this big exodus. It sounds very noble, but it didn't happen. They remained on the plantations, and they only moved after provocation, because they insisted on withdrawing their women and their young children from the field so they could work in their own provision grounds, they call them, plantains and so on, because they would sell the provisions, they would sell the livestock to get specie, hard currency. To the extent that they did that, they couldn't provide labor to the farmer, to the planter. Secondly, and perhaps most important, they formed task gangs. The young men would come together in groups, and they would go to a planter and say, we will cut your field for so much. Well, the European planters were not accustomed to negotiating with the Africans to start with, and some of them were unwilling to pay. And if they didn't pay, well, the people wouldn't work. So the African, for the first time, controlled his own labor. So the Europeans had two main devices. One was immigration, to bring in cheap labor, which they controlled. And they controlled it by means of the contract or the indenture. So they brought in Portuguese, even from 1835. That is before the practical emancipation, 1838. And then Indians started arriving from 1838. That is why this year Indians celebrate the 166th anniversary. So in anticipation of their failure to control African labor, they started with immigration of people from different European states and also from Asia. So that was very, very important. The second thing is they started to encumber the African villages with legislative and other impediments, to prevent the spread of the village movement. Taxation, if you had a push cart, you had to get a license for it. If you had a canoe, you had to get a license for it. If you were involved in any sort of vending, you had to get a license. So all of this licensing, all of this taxation went to finance immigration. So there was, at least from the early years of the post-emancipation period, a clash between the European planters and the African peasants. So it was not plain sailing. And what happened, particularly between 1839 and maybe 1849 or thereabouts, that first decade, is that the Europeans used their control of the legislature to squeeze the African villages, sometimes with physical floods, sometimes with taxation, sometimes by preventing the acquisition of new villages or new estates. And the result is that the African village movement was I would say, fractured. And many of them started to go into the hinterland, into timber, into gold mining, and so on. So it was not plain sailing. There was a clash, and the Africans came out, I think, the worse off for that clash. And I think maybe by the end of the 19th century, many of the hopes of the village movement had not been realized. And the plant was able to reestablish sugar. Perhaps if we destroy sugar then we wouldn't have had a problem now. But the 19th century, the destruction of, or the paralyzing of the village movement was achieved by the legislative means, by taxation, and by immigration. So it wasn't a smooth struggle, and many of the Africans started to leave the villages, to come into towns, to go into the hinterland. More or less, I would say, against their choice. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to build strong villages. But it was a question of provocation.
Now, we rolled around to the 20th and then, of course, now the 21st century. And we are told that in a certain sense, the Emancipation too, this release, as it were, from all of this poverty that seems to have beset us, can and perhaps will only be facilitated by greater expressions of entrepreneurial activity, some of which you mentioned in the early villagization program. Now, where is all of that going, David? Where did we lose our way here? I mean,
well, exactly. It's very difficult to put your finger on exactly where we lost the way. It's process. That emancipation for African Guyanese and for oppressed people must always be something that is constant. So that every day you've got to struggle for more emancipation. And as David pointed out, our foreparents came up against tremendous odds immediately after emancipation. And today when we talk about marginalization and all that kind of thing, we need to really go back there and see that from the outset, African Guyanese were being pushed to the margins of society, and they've had to struggle against that. Now, if one is going to talk about a vision for African Guyanese, or a vision for Guyana, one has to take that history into consideration. One has to talk about location, where the different races in the society are located in the political economy. And I think our nationalist leaders, in that sense, failed us. Because I don't think that they understood the historical forces, in that they thought that independence, political independence, constitutional independence, was the answer to everything. And they did not take into consideration the components that were coming into this new nation that was being formed, and where they were located.
well, you know what's interesting here? I mean, and it was a tremendous takeoff point when David says that the emancipation phenomena, as it were, created the Guyana state. We have made reference here to the fact of the diversification, which was a critical element, because what we had was free labor moving into mining, which at one time, the whole tradition of mining in this country, the Fofnaka story, it's around black people, African Guyanese, working in the timber industry. That's also not here. But yet we find in today's day, those very areas are no longer dominated by Africans.
and that is what I was alluding to.
Yes, could we make a...
In part, this was a continuation of the clash. The Europeans, you can say, to use a Rodneyite expression, underdeveloped the interior. They were not interested in developing roads, for example, in developing routes to facilitate mining, because labor would drain away from the plantations into the lucrative gold fields. So even the African intrusion into the gold and timber fields, Balata fields, was impeded by legislative inaction, to prevent them from going, prevent them from succeeding. And that is why up to now the hinterland has never been developed, because they did not want people to go away from the plantation. They wanted to lock the labor onto the coast. So many people have developed stereotypes of the Africans based on an imperfect understanding of the historical forces. For example, they say Africans don't like agriculture. You know, how did they feed themselves? You think that from the time of emancipation, you went into European shops to buy plantains and cassava. When the immigrants came, they ate food that was produced by the Africans. Even when the Blackbush Pole was being opened on the Quarantine Coast, people from Manchester would tell you that the neighboring villages provided planting material for Blackbush Pole. So the African villages were traditionally self-reliant. They loved agriculture because that is what they knew from Africa, and that is what sustained them in the post-emancipation period. You know, many of them were driven off of the farms because of flooding, disease, and other matters, other provocation by the Europeans. Similarly, business. We all know that the Africans clashed with the Portuguese in the famous Angel Gabriel riots and the St. Bread riots. But this was because African entrepreneurship was being stifled. And I think people need to examine the practices that were put in place to prevent African business class from developing. It's not that Africans don't like business. It is that they face some very serious obstacles, and those obstacles resulted in social conflict. So the two great myths about the Africans is that they didn't like the land, they fled from their land, is of course rubbish. And second, they didn't like business, you know, because many of them started off vending, started off peddling, but then Europeans would use taxation to
all right, we fast
right,
forward
the business.
We fast forward to
the
2004, and those comments about business and the land. Where are we to be located now?
I mean, not located at all in those sectors, and it has to do with a vision. It has to do with the second birth of the nation at the time of constitutional independence, and the vision for this nation that we were creating. And I think our leaders, both African, Guyanese leaders and national leaders, did not properly put forward a vision of where they wanted to go and how these parts, these components of this new society were going to operate within this new society, so that the post-emancipation clash that was taken to another level by the Crown Colony system, now come independence, you were trying to build a nation against international forces that are against a certain kind of development. And you have this whole new configuration, and those who, to quote Dr. Cheddy Jagan, those who were at the bottom of the ladder, were doomed to the bottom of the ladder and were pushed even further down to the bottom of the ladder. Now, here is where politics came in, because African Guyanese saw people who look like them controlling the politics. But those who controlled the politics of the society did not really control the political economy, because the political economy was determined by certain internal motion and certain external motion, and African Guyanese were not located in the political economy to really take advantage of that. And so what needed to be done at independence was a reconfiguration of the politics and the economics in the society, so that African Guyanese could be given the place. That was not done, because it came down to political survival on the part of those who were vying to run the place. So African Guyanese once again became victims of this clash. And the clash in the post-emancipation period was at two levels. The clash between the Indians and Africans for control of this new state, but also a clash between the nation, the individual nation state, and the world system, which militated against development by those who've been oppressed. And I would say that's where that second process of disintegration among African Guyanese started. And it has reached the point now where I would say that African Guyanese have lost almost all of what they brought into the new nation in 1966.
The thing is that we hear, whether it's myth or reality, And if you were to talk, if this were a panel of Guyanese of Indian ancestry, in all probability you would hear a reference to the fact that the reins of political power, once it was in the hands of an African-denominated party, or African-dominated party, that it precluded them from participating in the economy. But some or the other coming out of that process, we hear about the long 28 years and that story, it seemed as if the economy was fully well controlled by that group. How do you make that placement? First, one, the claim, two, the reality.
Well, I do not feel that the events of the 1960s, the immediate pre-independence period, have been sufficiently analyzed. Because up to that time, I would say there was a very strong Portuguese element in the economy. And on the part of the British government, there was an expectation that certain citizens would inherit the kingdom, and I think even from the time of 1953, they were surprised by the ferment among the masses, because they felt that decent citizens, the middle class, brown people, would have taken over from, as happened in maybe Jamaica and some other islands, and there would be a seamless transition to independence. But the ferment had started since the 1950s, and this boiled over in the 1960s into the most serious period of criminal violence we had in Guyana up to that time. And as a result of that, I feel that the Portuguese business class and also the Chinese business class was smashed. And certainly the people who arose, there was already a very prosperous Indian business class based on the land, coconut plantations, rice, and so on. It was largely a landed class, but they were able to use that capital to go into business much more easily than people without capital. So they were well placed to take over from the Sino-Portuguese business class. And I think from that time, in the Indian control of the economy was undisputed. So I don't buy this 28 years stuff, a lot of other nasty things happened in 28 years, but certainly the economic levers of the state were certainly in the hands of an already entrenched business elite. As far as the African role is concerned, I think unless you control the economy in any state, you're fooling yourself. There's no point controlling the boards and commissions if you don't control the economy. The economy is how you make a living, and that is the bottom line. So that was the illusion. It was an illusory control to set people up in political office, and ministry of this and the ministry of that. The real control is the economy. And I think that has remained unchanged for the last 40 years, if not longer.
And what has happened, I dare say, is that African Guyanese, unfortunately, got embroiled almost exclusively in the political aspect of things, either defending a government or taking part in this illusion that this government would at some point deliver the goods, so that they did not do what all subgroups in a society must do, is that you must operate at two levels. You must talk about strengthening intra-group relations, meaning strengthening the internal economy, strengthening the family, strengthening the educational resources. So we work at that level, simultaneously work at the national level, in terms of politics and so on and so forth. We, unfortunately, African Guyanese, were pulled into the second level and in fact neglected the intra-group dynamics. And so we're here in 2004 dealing with the same political aspect, but I think it's becoming more and more clear to us that we need to have a new vision. We need to take off a second time.
I don't think anything is wrong with having ethnic groups which have specialities. You know, some might be good at agriculture, some might be good at business, some might be good at academics, and so on. So I don't think anything is wrong with that. If you look at the organic theory of the Guyanese state, you'd see that, you know, we all perform different functions, but we all perform functions which are complementary to each other. So I don't have a problem with having a business elite or a political elite or a cultural elite or any group of people which specializes in a particular aspect of the society. But what I'm saying is that control shouldn't be used for domination, and it shouldn't be used to create alienation or marginalization of other groups. I mean, for example, because the Amerindian doesn't have control of certain economic levers, I don't think he should be excluded from the political process, from the social or the cultural process. You know, I think the state must extend to him, wherever he lives, reasonable access to education or reasonable access to the other values of the state. And we must look to ensure that regardless of whether we talk about socialism or capitalism, or regardless of the size of one ethnic group or another ethnic group, every citizen is treated as an equal under the law. And I think that's what is important. It's not your ethnicity as such. It's not whether they're African businessmen or Indian businessmen. It's whether you have honest businessmen.
Yes. I tell you what, David Hines introduced the notion of the family in all of this. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we are going to look at the dynamics, how the interplay between this new state and the African condition with regard to family. Much has been said about the African family, and in a certain sense, it's almost been used in the context of the failing family. And much has been attributed in terms of the lack of material progress of Africans to this notion of the failing African family. Any comments, gentlemen?
It's a very difficult concept to examine unless you do it on a historical basis. For example, directly after emancipation, many Africans were very concerned about the families. As you know, during the period of enslavement, some of them were not permitted to marry. But you know, wherever they were, they tried to reestablish the families. They tried to take the women out of the cane fields. They tried to take the children out of the cane fields, to consolidate the family unit, and to set up family farms or family businesses. Many of them perhaps did not marry in churches. One, because they weren't accustomed to doing that, and two, because they felt they would have had to satisfy European norms for dress and ritual. But they continued to have stable families, although they weren't churched. And I think many of the families eventually aspired to the European norm, mother, father, children, constituting a nuclear family in a household. I think that was the norm, and that's what people continued to aspire to. I think there were several problems affecting the family, and I think if we can fast forward or jump forward to the period of the Depression, particularly, you know, from the mid-70s to the mid-80s or even mid-90s, which I call the Depression. What happened, I think, is that many Africans were affected by downsizing, retrenchment, and general unemployment. So fathers started to leave the home, maybe to go to the Caribbean islands to look for work, or to go to the gold fields, or to go to neighboring countries. Many mothers now had to work, had to leave the children at home, or had to leave the household to go to work. Some of them became vendors. If you look at the vendors, you see there's a gender imbalance. Many of the vendors are women. The result was that many of the children were left unattended, because father out of the house, mother out of the house, and you have immature children. So I think we are now seeing a result or consequence not of the old African family, which was very solid. And I think if you go to the village, or if you go to old families, everybody knew where they came from. Everybody knew where mommy and daddy was, you know. But what has happened is a more recent phenomenon, that during the Depression, particularly from the mid-70s, because of economic necessity, unemployment, poverty, many of the families started to shake because fathers had to go far away from home and mothers had to go far away from home sometimes. And we started to see for the first time in the history of the African Guyanese community, street children, beggars, because, the family unit started to crumble. And this happened really over the last 30 years. It didn't happen over the last 130 years, I can tell you that.
And is this where we should locate, in part, the difficulty of our males, their underachievement, or there must be some other things that we should be looking at?
No, that's a contributory factor. And what also contributed to the condition of our males is the whole stereotype again of what the African male is. The stereotype of the African male as stud, as having a monopoly of force, and so on and so forth, with the lack of, with the breakdown of the family, with the breakdown of the village, or the break up of the village, with all of that, there were a loosening of values. And so I think some of our males have somehow bought into some of these stereotypes. And if you buy into certain stereotypes, then there are certain outcomes of that. So it's both externally driven, but as it's externally driven, internally you disintegrate, values go, sense of self and sense of community go, and so therefore our people are left naked, and so our young men have been left naked, not a sense of self, and so they buy into stereotypes.
But the thing is that, all right, at one level, agreed, but from what I gathered, the prevailing body of information is saying is that even in the context of boys and girls raised within the same family structure or family destructure, that the boys were doing decidedly less. They were underachieving compared to the girls. I wonder.
Well, as I was saying, I mean, what is achievement? And to the young African boy, achievement is wearing the name brand and fast money and that kind of thing, and hiring themselves out as assassins and all of those things. And we've got to be frank about these things, that the whole notion of what is achievement has changed within. So as the boys begin to have notions, as David said, the women were forced to move into the slot of taking care of the family. And so the women began to devise a new sense of what achievement was. And first and foremost for them, achievement was trying to hold this thing together. I mean, it was a hard task, but that is where the women came in, because the women now became fathers and mothers. And so, as they would say in the streets, the women developed somewhat more of a balance than the males. That's my take on it.
And it's also, to continue from David's point, the absence of role models, or perhaps the presence of the wrong role models, had an effect on the young African males. Who was, at school, for example, in my day, I went to an all-boys school, and they were, out of a staff of 30, you probably had just one female, So your role models were strong male figures. But we have been unable to adjust to the transition in Guyanese society. I think it's a question of managing change. So some of the old formulae, some of the old covenants, could not cope with the new changes. Certainly, in the era in which all of us grew up, they were very strong male role models, but now a teacher in a school is very likely to be female. And I don't think many people have adjusted to that. So it's not just something is happening to the family, something is happening also in the school, something is happening in the wider society. That women have been liberated, maybe because of poverty, maybe because of the travails of the 1970s and 1980s, women have been liberated from the household. But at the same time, those are the models. The woman is now the model, and some young men just cannot adjust to that. They cannot cope with that. I mean, there are some cases of both inside and outside Guyana where you have very successful females, and sometimes you see the male or the husband sometimes being almost a nuisance because he cannot cope with the reality of having a stronger wife or wife who's earning more than he is. You know? It's an adjustment which other societies have had to make, but we've been very slow in doing that in Guyana and also some other countries in the Caribbean.
Yeah, something that needs to be promoted.
And Grantley, before you go on, I think at this point I want to stress that the African Guyanese condition and the causes of it have to be properly examined, because the popular notion is that the African Guyanese condition is as a result of the Indians and the Indian government and so on. I suppose one can look and find something there. But the African Guyanese condition is historical, first and foremost. But it's also global. There has always been a global order, whether it's colonialism, whether it's capitalism, whether it's this new thing that we call globalization, that impact on black people, wherever we find ourselves, whether in Guyana, in Africa, in other parts of the Caribbean, in the United States, that when the IMF says to the government, you've got to downsize government, who works for government? Black people. You see, when the IMF and the World Bank says that you've got to put more money in agriculture, who is not in agriculture? Huh? When businesses get incentives under this structural adjustment, who is not located in the business sector? And so therefore understanding the African Guyanese condition must be looked at both in terms of the internal dynamics. Yes, there is something there about the equitable distribution of resources inside of Guyana, but there's also something that is historical and global that impacts on the Guyanese condition, the African Guyanese condition.
Interesting. But the thing is that despite the fact of increasing poverty, there is a general sense in which one could probably still make generalizations, dangerous though they might be, about the sense of thrift, and perhaps one to take it across various lines. So you would like to make a quick comment there, David?
Well, you see, again, you have to, I'm not a historian, as I said, but I think there are lessons in history. How is it that the African people could have saved up $1 million under slavery to buy their villages and their farms, within 10 years of emancipation? They had to be thrifty. I mean, when you convert $1 million in 1838, you know what that will convert to nowadays. So it's nothing genetic. It's nothing ethnic. You have to look at what happened when they were forced into waged labor as workers and as civil servants, when they were forced off of the villages through flooding, through disease. And there was a time in the 19th century when the African population was falling. Not standing still, it was falling because of cholera, because of filariae, because of malaria. So they were being ravaged in the countryside, and many of them fled to the cities, where they took up menial jobs. They did not dominate the civil service, as some writers like to say. They went in at a very low level, and up to 1965, there was not a single African permanent secretary. So they went in at menial levels, and they were all wage laborers. And as David is saying, when we went into the era of structural adjustment, of downsizing, of economic recovery, the wage laborers were the ones who were retrenched, and they did not have the skills to simply embark on new enterprises. And they had left the farms, and they'd also left private enterprise. Yes. So they were accustomed to working for salaries, and it just taken away.
David, the corollary of the notion of thrift is that of spending. It was interesting that there's a series being run by Channel 9, though it would talk to an American situation where black Americans were trying to work their way, much as we are trying to work our way through their dilemma. And the point was made that despite the fact that in absolute and relative terms, black people had the smaller share of the economic pie, they were the largest consumers of all sorts of things that had not anything to do with the generation of further wealth.
Because they were targeted as consumers, and they come to believe that they're born to be consumers. And I take your point. I think we have got to be frank. There are institutional and historical causes for the drift in the African community in Guyana and other parts of the world. But at some point, we've got to ask ourselves, how are we going to correct this? And the first thing we've got to do to begin that process of correction is to say frankly where things are. And I think part of what I see here among the opinion shapers in the African Guyanese community is a reluctance to address those things in our community. Is a reluctance to address what we think is washing our dirty linen in public. You would have followed the comments made by Bill Cosby in the United States of America. And I think we need a kind of Bill Cosby phenomenon here to begin to say to African Guyanese, whatever the reasons that you're here now, whatever the reasons you've become the biggest consumers, whatever the reasons you're no longer saving as your foreparents did, within the context of our condition, given whatever little scope we have, we can begin to do better. And I think, first of all, we've got to establish leadership. Second, I think that we've got to begin to make the link between the past and the present. And I think David's comments are driving us in that direction. That it is not that black people are genetically and ethnically to these things. Yeah. That these things came into being as part of a process. And learned behavior can be unlearned. But first of all, we've got to be very honest about where we are. Because if you're not honest about where you are, then your prescription for countering the problem is going to be haywire. And my view is that we spend too much of our energies, our people's energies, on politics. I would rather see, rather than our people marching down the street and shouting this and shouting that, I would like to see our people in their communities, sitting down and working out within the context of the situation here in Guyana, how we can begin to empower ourselves. Because an empowered African Guyanese community would be an asset to this country. But more than that, it becomes a defense against some of the onslaughts that are being rained down on African Guyanese. So that as a political person, I'm not neglecting political involvement and political role, but I think there's too much of that and too little of really sitting down, going back to the drawing board and learning where we've come from and how we're going to get ourselves out of this hole.
I think also, if I can add, that many people in the Western Hemisphere underestimate the damage done during slavery. Mm-hmm. They believe that everything ended, 31st of July, 1838. And I think David was at pains to point out when we started that this is not, emancipation is not an event. It's a process. And you're not emancipated once, but you're continuously or perpetually or permanently emancipating yourself. What has happened now is that we can look back at our forefathers and see that they had a worldview. They knew they were Christians. You couldn't try to unchristianize them. They were Christian people. They knew they had to embrace education. They knew they wanted to establish homes. They knew that they had to work for a living. Nobody would be satisfied with begging for a living. But those values have been shaken. The foundations of African Guyanese society have been shaken. And we haven't had somebody or a group which could articulate this new worldview, to reestablish the values of thrift, of education, of faith. and there are a lot of school dropouts. That's a fact. I mean, you can easily compare dropping out of school with dropping out of the family or dropping out of work. People who just left the work because their mind get them to left it. So the ethic is gone, and what we're talking about now is the reformulation of a worldview for the African Guyanese community.
Yes, and which worldview? I think we've been nibbling at it here. Ultimately devolves and centers around the family, a notion of a reasserting of the notion of how one uses one's resources. I think it's for those who have had the benefit of some formal training in the power of compounding, that thing that they taught us very early in school, the power of compounding. $1,000 withdrawn from one's income every month religiously can cause one to move out of a state of poverty quite easily down the road. And it's just a question of reasserting, and every day reasserting the fact that we have got to refocus our consumption and our saving. Some things we could do without.
Well, you must bear in mind that I think David hinted at this as well, that some of the people who set themselves up as leaders have been predatory. Sometimes you may you may see a pastor, he's not interested in saving, he's interested in getting you to give him more, pay a tithe or to pay for prayer or something like that. You might get political leaders who are not interested in telling their people to be thrifty, but saying, come, make a donation to the party, give us more. So you've got a situation in which many of the people who set themselves up as leaders are interested in taking, not in teaching.
Well, I tell you, you brought us to the point as you introduced the notion of political leaders and political parties. These institutions that were intended to articulate and pursue the achievement of our freedom. I mean, that is why we set ourselves up with them. And in contemporary Ghana, one has a sense that political parties may be major contributors to our sense of lack of freedom and security. David just started alluding to one aspect of it, though in a minimal way. What do you wish to make a general comment on this?
Okay, well, basically, I mean, I said what I had to say, that we have not really been able to ensure that the ordinary people secure representation, that they don't hold their leaders to answer for their actions. Once a person is elected leader, he tends to, even for a sports club, he tends to be leader for life. So I think a part of the problem is the representation problem, that the masses do not see themselves as being so emancipated as to only select leaders who would safeguard that freedom. Sometimes in their very actions, they put leaders there who, in fact, damage their freedom and limit their freedom. And it happens in the church, it happens in political parties, it happens in social organizations, even sporting organizations. And I think if people understood the nature of emancipation, they take more care who they select as their leaders.
And they also take more care in the process by which you select leaders. Because the village, which was the most shining example of emancipation, not just here in Guyana, but in the rest of the Caribbean. I mean, it was what black people did with the villages here. It is really phenomenal. I mean, it goes beyond what the American Revolution did. I mean, the space in that 10-year period, what they were able to create. And that village was taken away from them in the sense that control over decision-making in the space, their own space, was taken away from them and what? Monopolized at a higher level. And so therefore our people were dispossessed by the very leaders who were supposed to empower them. They were disempowered. And so therefore part of what we've got to reclaim is power for people. Because ultimately African people are going to be responsible for change. Political parties have evolved into instruments of power. They are concerned with acquiring power and holding on to power. Modern political parties are not concerned with empowerment of people economically and politically. And people themselves have to become empowered, or what Rodney calls self-emancipation. That is the kind of emancipation that we've got to begin to talk about. That is the kind of worldview, I would posit, that we've got to begin to look at. A worldview that brings people into their own decision-making process. And so therefore leadership comes not from the top, but from the bottom.
I think for the last 40 years, it is difficult for the ordinary voters to determine who will represent them in the National Assembly. Sometimes they never know until they see the list published, announced by the party. You don't know who's going to represent you. What could be more fraudulent than that? Huh?
I tell you what, I was planning that that would have been the subject, the whole political aspect of emancipation, the subject of our second part in this discourse with Dr. David Hinds and Mr. David Granger. But even as we will close this first segment, I wonder if you could talk to a mechanism for empowerment of the people to take away some of this, that some of which they have lost by the leadership of the modern political party.
Well, I have faith. I have faith in the village movement. I think what has lived from the time of emancipation in 1838 to the present is the concept of the village, because the village enshrined all of what we've been talking about: struggle, emancipation, empowerment. And I would like to go back to that mechanism and reclaim that space. And I think that will have to be a struggle, so that there has to be a revolt from the bottom. And when I'm talking about revolt, I'm not talking about the kinds of revolt that we've been seeing, some of which I've been critical of, although I understand the origins of them. But I'm talking about a revolt of reason. A revolt of reason, where we allow the evolution of a worldview, that we go back into our communities, we go back into those sacred spaces and begin to commune at that level. Because politicians, I think, are not going to bring us solutions. Some of the African interest groups and the leadership are so out of touch with what's happening at the bottom that the solution is not going to come there. I think they are going to be useful at some point in helping to push the train forward. But I think we've got to go back to the village. And I have a lot to say about that kind of formulation in the villages. But I'll save that for the next program.
David?
I frankly do not have enough information to come to any conclusion. I'm aware of some of the serious problems in Amerindian villages. I'm aware of some of the serious problems in African villages and in Indian villages too. There is a problem of representation. I feel that we need to collect a lot of information from the people themselves to find out how they wish to be governed. I don't know enough, and I don't think that the models used by any administration, past or present, satisfy the real needs. People have needs with drainage and education and the way they day-to-day things. And I think we need to we need to go back to the drawing board in all types of villages: Amerindian villages, African villages, Indian villages as well, and try to find out what the people want and how the people's needs are to be satisfied. There's no point just creating a system calling it proportional representation and expecting everything else to work, or creating a regional system or NDCs. These things mean nothing to some of the people at the bottom there, who have flooded out for 2-3 weeks at a time, or don't have electricity.
That could be 6 months at a time, David. From one such village. On this segment of Emancipation 2, look at the African condition. We had the benefit of the thoughts of Dr. David Hinds and Mr. David Granger, where we focused, among other things, on some of the history of the emancipation process itself, the understanding of what that meant for the African family within the context of a socialization process, of immigration, and a world order that had some specific bearing on what choices he did make. We came to the point of looking at the organization of political parties as an answer to deal with some of the continuing process of emancipation sought by Africans and all other groups from wherever they have come in this country. The second part of this series will focus on some of the political choices, and we shall attempt to see where that takes us to this process of emancipation, the African condition, and what it means to this country. I'm Grantley Walron saying good night.